I had just stepped back from the podium, the final slide of the training program still glowing on the screen. 300 employees across multiple regions had completed my sessions, each prepared to run Helix Core with confidence. It was supposed to be my crowning moment, the culmination of months of work. Instead, Briggs turned it into a public execution. "You're done here. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the company." Leonard Briggs jabbed a finger toward me, his voice slicing through the boardroom like a whip. The timing wasn't random. It was strategy. He waited until the room was filled with applause, until the board members' faces were nodding with approval. To strike. The man didn't want me gone quietly. He wanted me humiliated at the peak of my success. He wanted my legacy reduced to a punchline. That was the conflict written in bold letters across the room. I had given Halverson Dynamics the backbone of its empire, the Helix Core system that managed billions in contracts. Yet the very moment my work shone brightest, I was erased. It wasn't business, it was theater, and I was the actor cast as the disposable fool. My name is Nova Kincaid. 8 years of my life had gone into this company. I wasn't born into privilege. My father repaired cars in a garage so drafty the winters froze his hands numb. My mother carried double shifts at a diner, smiling through exhaustion to keep food on our table. I learned early that the world never handed out opportunities. You had to claw for them. College was debt and sacrifice. Code studied on cracked screens, and nights fueled by cheap coffee. When I landed the role at Halverson, it wasn't just a job. It was validation that my struggle meant something. I poured myself into Helix Core. I slept in server rooms, carried notebooks filled with diagrams and emergency fixes, and missed birthdays and holidays because the system couldn't wait. Helix Core became the bloodstream of Halverson, fast, secure, indispensable. And yet, my name never appeared in press releases. Briggs made sure of that, because Leonard Briggs was everything I wasn't. He didn't build, he performed. He wore Navy suits like armor, spoke in polished sound bites that investors devoured, and turned other people's work into his resume. He was a climber, not a creator. And men like me, builders, architects, the ones who carried the weight, were merely scaffolding for his ascent. That morning, in front of the board, he wanted to send a message. He wanted them to see how disposable I was, how easily even the architect of a billion-dollar system could be discarded with a gesture and a sneer. His finger in my face, his smirk in full view. It wasn't just firing. It was erasure. Shock gripped me. Humiliation burned my chest. But under it all was something else. A seed of defiance. Briggs thought he had silenced me. He had no idea he had just lit the fuse. I walked out of that boardroom with humiliation still burning in my chest. But once the shock settled, resentment began to rise. It wasn't just about the way Leonard Briggs had humiliated me in front of the board. It was about everything that had come before, the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, and the promises I had believed. I didn't come from a world where people were born into polished suits and cushioned careers. My childhood was made of second-hand clothes and dinners stretched thin to feed a family of 4. My father worked in a drafty garage where winter winds cut through the cracked windows. His hands oil-stained and cracked from fixing engines that barely kept customers on the road. My mother pulled double shifts in a diner where she poured coffee for truckers at midnight and still managed to smile. We didn't have vacations or new appliances or even a working computer until I was a teenager. That first computer changed everything. It was old, its monitor bulky and buzzing. But to me, it felt like a portal to another world. I taught myself code line by line, often staying up until dawn because I knew those hours mattered more than sleep. In school, I wasn't the smartest in the room, but I was always the most determined. I didn't have tutors or mentors. I had library books, borrowed manuals, and persistence. Every bit of knowledge felt like stolen ground, wrestled away from a future that seemed determined to leave me behind. College wasn't easy. I juggled 2 jobs, stocking shelves at night, and fixing printers on campus, just to keep the tuition bill from crushing me. There were nights when I studied on an empty stomach, when rent checks bounced, and when the weight of debt felt unbearable. But I kept going, telling myself it would pay off if I could just get one chance. One company willing to see past the resume and into the fight I carried in me. Halverson Dynamics was that chance. Landing the job felt like stepping into sunlight after years of crawling through tunnels. I wasn't just an employee. I was part of something bigger. They needed a system, and I built one. They asked for reliability, and I gave them stability. They wanted speed, and I gave them Helix Core. Line by line, night by night, every milestone Halverson bragged about had my fingerprints hidden behind it. There had been other opportunities. I remembered one vividly, an offer from a rival firm. Nearly double the salary. Benefits that would have made my life easier. Debt payments lighter. The future less uncertain. But when I sat with Halverson's leadership back then, they promised me loyalty would be rewarded. They told me advancement was only a matter of time. That if I stayed the course, I would rise with them. So I turned the rival firm down. I walked away from the money, from the easier road, because I believed in Halverson. I believed in promises made across a polished conference table. Believed that, if I kept giving more than anyone else, the company would keep its word. And now, standing outside with the echo of Briggs's smirk still in my ears, that decision haunted me. The resentment tightened in my chest, not just toward Briggs, but toward myself, for being naive enough to trade security for loyalty in a place that had none. Sympathy from others might have seen me as a victim. But what burned in me was the knowledge that I had chosen this path. I had given up more than I could afford to lose because I trusted men like Briggs to honor their word. That betrayal cut deeper than the public humiliation, because it wasn't just Briggs who had pointed his finger and called me worthless. It was every handshake, every promise, every hollow assurance that had led me here. And I couldn't shake the thought, if I had said yes to that other offer, everything might have been different. But I didn't. And now all I had left was resentment, and the faint, stubborn ember of something else. Something Briggs hadn't counted on. Anger sharpened everything after that morning. The humiliation still lingered, but with every step away from the glass tower, the picture of Leonard Briggs grew clearer in my mind. His voice, his smug expression, his carefully orchestrated cruelty, none of it was new. It was simply the final act in a pattern I had ignored for too long. Leonard Briggs was not a builder. He was not a leader in the sense of guiding or creating. He was a politician dressed in corporate clothing, a man who thrived not on innovation, but on manipulation. He didn't understand Helix Core, not even at the most basic level. He couldn't explain a single protocol or line of code, yet he stood at podiums and delivered speeches about his vision, as if the system had been born in his head. Investors loved him because he spoke their language, confident projections, bold forecasts, and a grin that implied certainty. Employees feared him because they knew the cost of crossing him: silence, exile, or worse, public humiliation like the one I had just endured. I had always known he was hollow, but I hadn't realized how dangerous that hollowness could be until it was aimed directly at me. Briggs's entire empire rested on the ability to convince others that he was indispensable while quietly draining the talent of those around him. He had perfected the art of turning loyalty into weakness, of transforming dedication into fuel for his own climb. One memory in particular tightened my jaw as I walked. A televised interview 6 months earlier. The reporter had asked Briggs how Halverson Dynamics had managed to revolutionize global data integrations so quickly, and with a practiced smile, he leaned into the camera and said, "It was my vision from the beginning. I built Helix Core as a reflection of the standards I demand." I remembered watching it, frozen. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some angry on my behalf, others too cautious to say more than, "That's tough." my friend? The worst part wasn't hearing Briggs take credit. It was being ordered to stay silent. A message from the communications team landed in my inbox within an hour. Do not correct or comment. Official narrative must remain consistent. That day, I felt something snap inside me. All the nights I had sacrificed, all the birthdays I had missed, all the faith I had poured into the company, it was suddenly clear that none of it mattered. Briggs could erase me with a sentence, and I was expected to swallow the lie. The clarity of that moment haunted me every time I stepped back into the office. And yet, I stayed. That was the part that burned the most now. I stayed because I believed the system would speak for itself, that my work would eventually become undeniable. I stayed because I told myself loyalty still meant something, but standing in the wreckage of that loyalty, I realized Briggs had never seen me as anything more than scaffolding for his performance. He didn't care about Helix Core's design, its resilience, or the sleepless months that shaped it. He cared about the narrative, the story he could tell the board, the investors, the media. To him, Helix Core wasn't a system, it was a stage, and I had been the unseen hand behind the curtain, expected to keep pulling the ropes while he soaked in the applause. That was when anger shifted into clarity. I saw him for what he truly was, a man so desperate to appear irreplaceable that he destroyed the very people who made him valuable. He thrived on their silence, their compliance. And I realized, with an almost bitter taste in my mouth, that the humiliation in the boardroom hadn't been an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion to a game he had been playing for years. He believed he had erased me. He believed the system, the company, the narrative, all belonged to him. But in that clarity, a thought cut through my anger like a blade. He didn't own Helix Core. He never had. And no matter how many interviews he gave, no matter how many times he smirked into a camera, the truth was still buried deep inside the system itself. Truth he could never erase. Even in my angriest moments at Halverson, I had always kept one habit. I prepared for disaster. I knew systems could fail, leaders could lie, and companies could turn on the very people who built their foundations. That was why, years earlier, I had started building what I called the shadow system. It wasn't sabotage. Not then. It was meant to be a mirror, a hidden replica of Helix Core, quietly humming beneath the surface. Officially, it was a testing environment, a sandbox to simulate risks without endangering the live network. But, unofficially, it became something more, my insurance policy. Every line of code carried my imprint, every module quietly linked back to me. The idea came during one of those endless nights when I sat hunched over a glowing screen. The office silent, except for the hum of servers. I had just finished patching a bug that could have cost the company millions, and no one outside IT even knew it had happened. That night, I asked myself, what if the company decided I was disposable? What if they cut me loose after I had poured everything into this? That thought lingered like a shadow, and from it, the shadow system was born. At first, it was nothing more than a duplicate network running parallel to Helix Core. But as Briggs's ambition grew sharper and his betrayals more obvious, I refined it. I gave it autonomy. I taught it to recognize the fingerprints of its creator, not just my code style, but my very identity. The system began checking my biometric signature every time it synced, a scan of my fingerprint, a trace of my voice, a match to my encrypted key, if I was there. The shadow system kept running quietly in the background. If I disappeared, if my access was revoked, if my fingerprint never appeared again, the entire structure would slip into defense mode. And Helix Core, the system that Briggs flaunted to investors, would collapse into silence. No one else knew, not my colleagues, not even the engineers I trusted most. I buried the commands so deep they looked like maintenance protocols. To the casual eye, it was routine housekeeping. To the trained eye, it was invisible. The only person who could understand the full picture was me, and that knowledge carried with it a strange tension, unease, because I had tied my life so completely to this fragile mechanism, but also anticipation, because part of me wondered what would happen if Briggs ever dared to cross the line. The irony was that Briggs had signed off on the shadow system himself, years ago, when I had presented it as nothing more than a testing safeguard. He hadn't read the details. He never did. As long as the paperwork looked official and the buzzwords sounded impressive, he scribbled his signature and moved on. He thought he was approving another routine initiative. What he really approved was the foundation of his undoing. Living with the shadow system became a strange duality. Outwardly, I was the loyal architect, training teams, patching updates, delivering on every promise. Inwardly, I carried the knowledge that the system's heartbeat pulsed in sync with mine. I never spoke of it, never hinted at its existence, but every time Briggs took credit for my work, every time he smiled into a camera and said, "My vision," a small part of me almost wished he would test just how much of it was really his. That wish terrified me. It wasn't in my nature to seek revenge. I had built the shadow system for protection, not destruction. But after that boardroom humiliation, after the finger in my face and the words that stripped me down in front of everyone, I couldn't shake the thought. The shadow system was no longer just insurance. It was inevitability waiting for its trigger. And unease followed me with every breath. Because deep down, I knew Briggs would pull that trigger himself. All I had to do was wait. The sting of humiliation was still fresh. But beneath it, there was something else. Something Briggs hadn't counted on, even as his words echoed in my mind, even as my chest tightened with the weight of public disgrace. A sliver of satisfaction pulsed quietly under the surface, because I knew a secret he didn't. Months earlier, when Briggs approved the rollout of the training program for 300 employees, he thought it was his victory. He paraded it before the board as proof of his leadership. He framed it as an investment in the company's future, a bold step toward global expansion. What he never realized was that, in his rush to claim credit, he had signed away something he couldn't afford to lose. The approval packet had been thick, pages of routine signatures, compliance stamps, and procedural jargon that most executives never bothered to read. Briggs was no exception. He wanted speed. He wanted a headline. He wanted to stand in front of cameras and boast about how he was preparing hundreds of employees to operate the company's billion-dollar system. So when the paperwork landed on his desk, he didn't skim past the fine print. He ignored it entirely. That fine print was mine, buried in the legalese of training modules and intellectual property policies. I had inserted a clause, subtle, precise, perfectly legal. It stated that the ownership of all training extensions and associated modules belonged to the architect of Helix Core. In other words, me. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't sabotage. It was self-preservation. For years I had watched Briggs twist narratives, taking public credit for systems he couldn't even explain, demanding loyalty while discarding the very people who carried him. I knew better than to confront him directly. He held the board in his pocket. And I was only one voice. So I fought with the tools I had. The language of contracts, the quiet permanence of ink on paper. The day he signed that packet, I stood outside his office door, waiting for the folder to come back. He barely looked up as his assistant handed it off. Just another item checked off his endless list. Later, in the cafeteria, I overheard him bragging to a colleague, "Fastest approval I've ever given. I want that training program launched yesterday. The board's going to love it." He didn't know that in his haste to collect applause. He had cemented a truth he could never undo. The very modules he was celebrating belonged to me. The fingerprint scans, the layered protocols, the system architecture built into those sessions. Legally, they were mine to control. That knowledge became a quiet ember I carried with me, tucked beneath the layers of exhaustion and bitterness. Every time Briggs strutted past my workstation with a grin, every time he boasted about his system, I let the ember glow a little brighter. Outwardly, I remained the obedient architect, the loyal trainer, the man pushing others to mastery. Inwardly, I knew the balance of power had already shifted, and when Briggs stood in that boardroom, jabbing his finger at me and declaring my worthlessness, part of me almost pitied him. He thought he had humiliated me at the peak of my achievement. He thought he had written me out of the story. But what he didn't understand was that he had written his own exit the moment his pen scratched across that clause. The hurt was real, years of sacrifice reduced to a performance meant to elevate his ego, but beneath it, beneath the humiliation, there was satisfaction in knowing that he had set the trap himself. He had given me the leverage. He had handed me ownership, legally and irrevocably, without a second glance. I walked out of the building carrying nothing but my notebook and coffee mug. But deep inside, I carried something far more powerful, a document signed by Leonard Briggs himself. And that document was no ordinary paper. It was the quiet, undeniable proof that Helix Corps' fate had never been his to control. The security guard didn't touch me, but his presence was enough. He walked a half step behind me, his heavy boots echoing against the polished tile like punctuation marks to my disgrace. To anyone watching, it might have looked like I was being escorted out for theft or fraud, not for finishing the greatest achievement of my career. The weight of humiliation pressed hard on my shoulders, but I refused to let it bend my spine. If Briggs wanted a spectacle of defeat, he wouldn't get it from me. I carried only two things: my coffee mug and the black notebook I had kept since my first day at Halverson. Years of sketches, diagrams, fixes, and late-night breakthroughs were etched in those pages. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Everything else, my ID badge, my access cards, my place in the company, was gone. Every step toward the exit stirred the rage inside me. Not the loud kind of rage that burns and shouts, but the kind that coils in silence, gathering strength with every heartbeat. I wanted to turn, to throw Briggs's smug words back in his face, to remind the board that, without me, Helix Corps was nothing but a shell. But dignity kept my mouth shut. As we passed the row of training rooms, I caught sight of faces peeking out from doorways. Engineers, analysts, young staff who had spent the last months under my guidance. They didn't clap. They didn't speak. But their eyes followed me, wide and uncertain. And I knew they understood something wasn't right. Briggs could smear my reputation with one announcement, but he couldn't erase what those employees had seen for themselves. Then it happened. Just as I reached the lobby, a young man I recognized, Eli, one of the newest recruits, slipped from the crowd. He moved quickly, like a shadow, and as the guard looked away, he pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. His eyes met mine for only a second. But that second carried more weight than all the years of Briggs's empty promises. By the time I stepped into the cold air outside, I unfolded the note. 4 words, scribbled in hurried pen. We know who really built it. For the first time since the boardroom humiliation, I felt the corner of my mouth twitch upward. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the grim acknowledgement that truth, however buried, still found its way through the cracks. Briggs could silence me, strip me of my badge, and parade my exit as proof of his authority. But he couldn't erase the knowledge of the people I had trained. 300 employees carried my fingerprints in their understanding of Helix Corps. They might not speak today, but they knew, and one day, that knowing would matter. I clutched the note inside my fist as I walked farther from the glass tower. Rage still coiled in my chest, but dignity held it firm. Briggs wanted me broken, wanted me small enough to be forgotten. Instead, he had created something else, a woman stripped of illusions, but not of resolve. My notebook pressed against my palm, the words on that slip of paper burning in my mind. I didn't need to shout my worth in that moment. I didn't need to beg for recognition or fight to stay in a place that had already decided I was disposable. Dignity meant walking away in silence, knowing that the very system Briggs boasted about still pulsed with my signature, waiting. And though he thought he had ended me, Briggs had only lit the fuse. He had turned my quiet insurance into inevitability. I walked out not as a man defeated, but as one holding the calm before the storm. While I walked away from Halverson's glass tower with only a notebook and a slip of paper in my pocket. Inside those walls, unease had already begun to stir. In one of the smaller monitoring rooms, buried 2 floors below the boardroom where Briggs had paraded my humiliation, a young engineer named Carter leaned over his desk. He was new, barely 6 months in, but sharp. The kind of junior who read logs line by line instead of skimming dashboards. That afternoon, while reviewing Helix Core's synchronization reports, he froze. There, buried in the cascading text, was a line he didn't recognize. Biometric check. Architect signature missing. The words pulsed like a warning light in his mind. He ran the query twice, thinking it was an error. But the log repeated itself. Time-stamped and precise. Biometric verification tied to the system's architect. Me. Carter's stomach knotted. He knew I had been fired that morning. Everyone knew. The halls had carried the whispers faster than any official memo. But if Helix Core was still searching for my biometric confirmation, what would happen now that it would never find it? He didn't wait. Carter printed the log snippet and marched upstairs, clutching the paper in sweaty hands. He felt small walking into the executive floor, but anxiety overrode fear. He asked to see Briggs directly. Somehow, perhaps out of curiosity, Briggs allowed it. "What is this?" Briggs asked, barely glancing up from his phone as Carter laid the printout on the desk. "It's from this morning's synchronization log," Carter explained quickly, his voice tight. "The system is running a biometric check. Your architect's signature. It's programmed to look for Nova Kincaid's confirmation. Sir, if it doesn't find it, the process could—" Briggs cut him off with a wave of his hand, his smirk curling as if Carter were a child bringing him scribbles. "Leftover nonsense," Briggs said flatly. "Nova Kincaid probably left her fingerprints all over the system. Old code. Doesn't mean a thing." Carter swallowed, his throat dry. "But, sir, this line, it's active. It's not archived. It's running every cycle. If the condition fails—" Briggs leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you really think I'm going to walk into the boardroom and tell them the billion-dollar system is hinging on the fingerprints of a woman I fired this morning? Don't waste my time. Clean it up if you're worried. Otherwise, drop it." The dismissal stung more than the words. Carter knew the risk of pressing further. In Halverson's culture, questioning the CEO twice was a fast track to career suicide. So he nodded, gathered the paper, and left. Though the unease sat heavy in his chest, back at his desk, he stared at the code, unable to shake the dread. He thought about sending an anonymous note to IT leadership, thought about saving copies of the logs. In the end, fear won. He closed the file, pushed the printout into the shred bin, and returned to his assigned tasks. But the system kept running its check. Quietly, invisibly. Helix Core asked again and again. Architect signature missing. Each failed cycle tightened the noose, invisible to those who refused to see. And Briggs's arrogance sealed it. By brushing off Carter's warning as Tandu Voongia, he ignored the fuse already burning beneath his empire. He thought he had rid himself of me completely. That firing me meant severing every tie. What he didn't realize was that my absence wasn't just symbolic, it was functional. Without my confirmation, the system would reach a point it could no longer sustain. The suspense coiled in the silence of server rooms and the hum of data centers. Anxiety spread only to the ones who noticed the logs flicker strangely, to the juniors too timid to speak, To the few who whispered that something wasn't right, Briggs went on, smiling for investors, dismissing every warning with the same smug certainty. And in that ignorance lay the seed of collapse. The morning air felt sharper than usual, cold against my skin as I stood on the sidewalk outside Halverson's tower. Commuters hurried past, none of them aware that the glass monument behind me was built on a foundation I had laid brick by brick, line by line. My humiliation still lingered, but it had hardened into something else, an uncanny stillness. A waiting. I lifted my wrist and checked the time. 9:57 a.m. 5 minutes. Inside those walls, Leonard Briggs was likely in the boardroom, puffing his chest as he delivered his victory speech. I could almost hear his voice, dripping with self-congratulation. This morning I cut major costs, streamlined leadership, were leaner, faster, more efficient. He would sell my dismissal as a masterstroke, proof of his ruthless brilliance. The board would nod, investors would clap, and Briggs would bask in the glow of his own performance. But what he didn't know, what no one inside that room knew, was that another clock had already started ticking. Not the one on my wrist, the one buried deep inside the system itself. The shadow system had been running its cycles all morning, whispering its hidden checks, scanning for my confirmation. Each failed scan moved it closer to its programmed response, and once it reached the final threshold, there would be no going back. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about sabotage. It was about inevitability. I had designed Helix Core to protect itself from reckless hands, to shut down if ever it was stripped from the architect who understood it best. I looked up at the tower, glass reflecting the pale light of morning. Behind those windows were hundreds of employees. 300 I had trained myself, each one unknowingly dependent on the signature missing from the code. Briggs thought he had erased me. In truth, he had erased the very key that kept his empire breathing. 9:59 a.m. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of the seconds. Not fear, resolve, silent, steady, like the hum of servers before the crash. Around me, traffic horns blared, shoes clicked against concrete. Life moved as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But I knew the truth. I had always known this moment might come, even as I told myself it wouldn't. The anticipation coiled tight in my chest. This was the crossroads of years of sacrifice and betrayal, of loyalty misplaced and pride trampled. Briggs's arrogance had set the fuse. My absence was the match. 10:01 a.m. Somewhere above, in that boardroom, Briggs was still performing, painting himself as the visionary who had saved millions by discarding me. He couldn't see the cracks spreading beneath his feet. The shadow system didn't care about his smirk or his speeches. It cared about one thing, the absence of my signature. And then, as the second hand crept forward, I whispered to myself, not as a vow, but as acknowledgement, it's time. 10:02 a.m. The countdown ended. Deep within Halverson's servers, processes halted, data streams severed mid-transfer, contracts worth billions froze in suspended code. Across time zones, branch offices stared at dead screens, systems flickering black in unison. What looked like silence from the outside was chaos on the inside. The heartbeat of Helix Core stopped, and with it, the illusion of Briggs's control. I didn't move. I didn't gloat. There was no fist raised, no shout of triumph, just the stillness of resolve, the quiet weight of inevitability. I had built this moment not out of malice, but out of necessity. And now, standing beneath the tower that had cast me out, I felt no need to storm back in. The system itself was speaking on my behalf. Briggs had wanted the board to see his power. Instead, they would see his empire crumble in real time. And I, silent, waiting, steady, would be exactly where I was meant to be. The silence came first, inside Halverson's command center. The low hum of servers and the rhythmic chatter of keyboards suddenly cut off. Screens flickered once, then again, before collapsing into black. For a few seconds, no one moved. Analysts exchanged confused glances, half believing it was a power glitch, but the lights overhead still burned bright. The air conditioning still hummed. Only the lifeline of the company, Helix Core, was gone. At 10:02 a.m., the system froze across the globe. Transactions halted midstream. Files hung in limbo. Video conferences dissolved into static. And then, one by one, offices from London to Singapore, from Chicago to Dubai, reported the same words. The system isn't responding. $2.1 billion worth of active contracts were suspended in the void. Ticking with each second, they remained unresolved. Investors waiting on automated confirmations grew restless. Partners expecting seamless integration stared at stalled dashboards. Inside the boardroom, Leonard Briggs was still speaking when the first notification popped up on the massive display behind him. His slide presentation evaporated into a blunt black screen. Then, in large white letters, words appeared. Unauthorized. Original architect required. The room went still. At first, some of the directors chuckled nervously, assuming it was a prank, a stray error from IT. But as seconds turned into a minute, the weight of those words sank in. Phones vibrated across the table. Assistants burst in through the doors, pale and frantic. "Sir, global access is down," one of them shouted. "None of the branches can log in. Everything's stopped." Briggs's smile faltered for the first time. "It's a glitch," he said quickly, waving his hand. "A minor sync issue. Get it on it." But it was already on it. Engineers swarmed into the command center, eyes wide as they tried every restart, every emergency override, every backup plan they had rehearsed. Nothing worked. Each attempt brought them back to the same merciless message. Unauthorized. Original architect required. Hey. Sweat gathered at the back of Briggs's neck as the calls grew louder. Screens in New York, in Berlin, in Hong Kong, everywhere, flashed the same line. Board members leaned forward, whispers rising into sharp questions. "What does that mean, Leonard?" one demanded. "It means exactly what it says." Another answered grimly before Briggs could speak. "The system wants the original architect, and he's not here." Panic rippled through the executives. Hands slammed against tables. Phones buzzed endlessly with angry voices on the other end. Clients, investors, government regulators demanding explanations. Every second of downtime was money bleeding out, relationships fracturing, reputations collapsing. Briggs tried to steady himself, standing tall at the head of the table. "This is Kincaid's doing," he snapped. His voice strained. "She must have planted this safeguard." But even as he said it, doubt flashed in his eyes, because the truth was worse. Kincaid hadn't needed to sabotage anything. Briggs himself had fired the one woman the system still recognized as its heart. Downstairs, engineers shouted conflicting reports. Some said rollback wasn't possible. Others argued for emergency patches. But every attempt returned the same error. Unauthorized. Without Nova Kincaid's biometric key, Helix Core refused to obey anyone. The chaos spilled outward. News outlets picked up the outage within minutes. Halverson Dynamics suffers unexplained global failure. One headline blared. The company's stock plummeted in real time. Red numbers spiraling down screens as panicked investors dumped shares. In offices across the world, employees stared helplessly at blank monitors. Some whispered Kincaid's name, remembering the architect who had trained them, who had guided them through the complexity of Helix Core. They knew. Even if the board wouldn't admit it, the system wasn't broken. It was rejecting everyone who wasn't him. Briggs gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He barked orders that no one could follow. "Get me control back! Reboot the core! Call the vendors!" His voice grew shrill as each command returned the same response. "Failure. Finally." One of the directors leaned back, his voice cold and cutting. "Leonard, you bragged not an hour ago that you had cut unnecessary costs, but it seems you've cut the one thing this company couldn't live without." Briggs's face flushed crimson. His carefully constructed mask of control cracked under the weight of the moment. The humiliation he had crafted for me was returning to him, amplified 100-fold, displayed across every branch, every news outlet, every collapsing stock ticker. Chaos reigned in the boardroom. Panic spread like fire. And above it all, glowing on every screen, the words repeated like a verdict that no one could silence. Unauthorized. Original architect required. The boardroom was no longer a chamber of authority. It had turned into a storm. Phones buzzed endlessly. Directors shouted over one another. Assistants rushed in and out with scraps of bad news. Every screen in the building was locked on the same merciless line. Unauthorized. Original architect required. For the first time since the system collapsed. Leonard Briggs wasn't speaking. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but his eyes still darted from person to person, as though he could wrestle back control by sheer force of will. The chaos around him only amplified his silence. It was then that the head of the legal department, Margaret Lewis, entered with a thick folder clutched in her hands. Her gray suit was wrinkled, her glasses slipping down her nose, but her voice was steady. "I've reviewed the training program documentation," she announced. "All of it, the contracts, the approval packets, the intellectual property clauses." The room quieted, every director turning toward her. Briggs straightened, relief flickering across his face. "Good. Tell them it's sabotage. Tell them Nova Kincaid left traps in the code. Tell them this was engineered." Margaret shook her head. "No, this isn't sabotage, it's enforcement." She opened the folder, sliding copies across the table. Clause 14.2. Ownership of training extensions and modules remains with the original architect. That clause was approved and signed by you. Leonard. The words landed heavier than any system failure could. A murmur rippled around the table. Pages rustled as board members scanned the highlighted lines, their faces shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "You're saying," one director began slowly, "that the training modules, the very ones integrated into Helix Core, aren't Halverson property?" "They're not," Margaret confirmed. "They belong to Nova Kincaid. By legal definition, she retains the authority to activate, deactivate, or restrict them, which explains the message we're seeing. The system isn't broken. It's simply doing what it was designed to do. Recognize its rightful owner." All eyes turned to Briggs. His hands trembled as he reached for the documents, scanning the signature at the bottom of the page. His own, scribbled hastily months ago when he was more interested in bragging rights than fine print. The silence stretched long and heavy, until one director leaned back in his chair and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the others to hear, "He just fired the owner." The sentence cracked the air like a verdict. For a moment, no one breathed, and then the murmurs erupted again, louder, sharper this time. "You signed away control? You didn't even read the clauses? You humiliated the women who still holds the keys?" Briggs stammered, his voice breaking under the weight of accusation. I thought it was boilerplate, standard training language. Nobody told me." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "It was your responsibility to read it, Leonard. And now the company is exposed. Nova Kincaid doesn't just hold the power technically, she holds it legally. Without her, Helix Core is untouchable." Vindication rose like a tide in the room, though it wasn't spoken in my presence. I wasn't there to see it, but I knew, for years, Briggs had stolen credit, silenced my voice, and paraded my work as his. Now the truth had clawed its way to the surface, undeniable, written in the very ink of his own hand. Board members whispered in corners, some with anger, others with resignation. The empire Briggs claimed to control was no longer his. He had cut me out, believing he was eliminating dead weight. Instead, he had severed the lifeline of the company. And while panic still rattled the room, beneath it there was something else. The slow, simmering acknowledgement that justice was taking shape. My humiliation had been public. Now, so was his. By noon, the story had broken across every major network. Screens in cafes, airport lounges, and trading floors all carried the same headline in bold red letters. Halverson Dynamics loses 2.1 B in global crash. Ownership unclear. Clips replayed on a loop. Board members shuffling papers in panic. The company's stock plummeting in real time. And experts speculating on the mysterious original architect, referenced in the error message. For the first time, my name, Nova Kincaid, was whispered on air, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty. I sat alone in a quiet diner, just 2 blocks from the glass tower I'd been escorted out of hours earlier. The hum of conversations around me was drowned out by the television overhead, where analysts argued whether Halverson could survive the week. Each word slid over me like cool water, numbing and steady. The sting of humiliation hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, muted by the strange calm of watching the truth unfold without me lifting a finger. My coffee sat untouched as I listened. The anchor read from a teleprompter. Sources inside Halverson confirm that the collapse may be tied to intellectual property owned not by the company, but by a former employee. Legal experts suggest that if confirmed, Halverson could face liability exceeding the current 2.1 B freeze. Cold satisfaction pulsed through me. Briggs's arrogance had been his undoing, not my revenge. I hadn't needed to storm back into the building or shout my worth. The system itself, the code I had written, had spoken louder than anything I could have said. And now, the world was listening. I thought of the faces of the employees I had trained, the 300 who knew, even if they never dared to say it aloud, that Helix Core had been mine from the beginning. I wondered if they were watching the same headlines, if they felt vindicated too. Knowing the truth had found daylight. The vibration of my phone on the counter broke my thoughts. Unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in me said to answer. Nova Kincaid? A voice asked. It was steady, warm, and strangely familiar. Yes, I replied cautiously. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. You probably don't remember me, but we worked together back in the integration team. 5 years ago. I'm Ava Grant now, Vice President at Claris Tech. Recognition sparked. Ava! She had been sharp, ambitious, and outspoken, qualities Briggs had despised. She'd left Halverson abruptly after one too many clashes with management. We've been watching, Ava continued. The whole industry has. What happened today, it's proof of what we've known all along. You were the architect, not Briggs, and you don't belong on the outside. I leaned back in my seat, gripping the phone tighter. What are you saying? I'm saying, she replied, her voice lowering. We've been waiting for you. Claris Tech doesn't just want your system, we want you. The board is ready to meet. We can give you the freedom Halverson never did. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. Outside the diner window, the Halverson Tower loomed, a monolith now stripped of its power, its lights still flickering with the aftershocks of collapse. Inside, my chest carried the quiet weight of satisfaction, not the fiery thrill of vengeance, but the cool certainty of justice taking shape. For years, Briggs had silenced me, stolen credit, and paraded my work as his own. Now, without me saying a word, the truth was not only exposed, it was drawing me towards something greater. I opened my eyes, staring at the tower one last time. Tell your board, I said slowly. I'm listening. Wai-ee. From the 32nd floor. Leonard Briggs's shouts could still be heard echoing through the halls. His voice, once so polished for cameras, had become nothing more than a raw, panicked rasp. He screamed at engineers, berated assistants, and begged directors for more time. But time had already run out. The board no longer looked at him as a visionary. They looked at him as the liability he truly was. Papers spread across the table, lawyers flipping pages with tight lips, directors leaning in with sharp questions. Why didn't you read the clauses? Why did you fire the architect without review? Every word was a nail in the coffin of Briggs's career. The same arrogance he used to strip me of dignity now turned against him in full force. An official investigation into his leadership was announced before the hour ended. Outside, I stood quietly on the sidewalk, notebook in one hand, coffee mug in the other. Above me, the glass tower flickered. Monitors across every floor carried the same frozen message. Unauthorized, original architect required. The empire Briggs had stolen from was rejecting him in real time, as if the system itself had joined in the verdict. And then it happened. The great Halverson logo at the top of the tower, once glowing proudly against the skyline, sputtered and went dark. A blackout. Small at first, then total, sweeping across the rooftop sign like a curtain falling on the end of a play. For a moment, the building looked lifeless, a monument to a failed illusion. The timing was uncanny. Just as the last light vanished, the clouds broke. A shaft of sunlight cut through the morning sky and landed squarely on the pavement where I stood. Warm, steady, undeniable. I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. The weight of humiliation, betrayal, and silence slipped away, replaced by something purer, liberation. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the company badge I had carried for nearly a decade, and held it in my palm. Its plastic edges were worn, the logo scratched from years of use. With one final glance upward at the tower, I tossed it into the trash bin beside me. No ceremony, no anger, just release. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I answered without hesitation. The message was simple, the voice steady. Mrs. Kincaid, the system deserves you. Let's build it right this time. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by Briggs's arrogance or Halverson's shadow. I was free to build again, on my terms, with my name, and with people who valued truth over theater. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. Dignity stolen in silence had been returned in daylight, brighter than any logo on a glass tower. Every betrayal leaves a scar, but scars remind us of what we survived and what we're capable of creating after. If this story struck something in you, share your thoughts below, leave a comment, like this video, share it with someone who's faced their own unfair battle. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us, dignity can be stolen, but it can also be reclaimed.